There's a reason red hair catches your attention, not because it's rare, because your brain recognizes it as a signal. Only about 1 to 2% of the world's population naturally has red hair. Yet for thousands of years, this single genetic trait has inspired myths, sparked suspicion, shaped royal bloodlines, and left scientists asking a surprisingly difficult question. Why did it survive? For generations, the simple explanation sounded complete enough. Red hair was treated as little more than a random mutation, a harmless quirk caused by a change in a pigment gene. A genetic accident that happened somewhere in Europe's distant past and lingered in a small percentage of people ever since. It seemed straightforward, until DNA began telling a much older story. Ancient genomes recovered from Ice Age skeletons, Bronze Age cemeteries, and medieval burial grounds started revealing patterns that refused to fit the traditional explanation. Researchers found that the mutation behind many cases of red hair is old, but not singular. Different populations carry different variants. Some appeared independently. Others spread with migrations that reshaped entire continents. That changes everything. A trait carried by millions of people today may not be the legacy of one ancestor or even one civilization. It may be the surviving fingerprint of repeated chapters in human history, written across thousands of years of migration, isolation, adaptation, and survival. And that story stretches far beyond Scotland or Ireland. It reaches into prehistoric Europe, across the frozen landscapes left behind by the last ice age, through the movements of early farming communities, and into a gene that quietly influences far more than hair color. Because the same DNA that gives some people copper-colored hair also affects pain sensitivity, vitamin D production, skin pigmentation, and the way the body responds to sunlight. Scientists are still uncovering its full significance. By the end of this story, you'll see why red hair is not simply an unusual appearance. It is evidence of an ancient journey that your DNA never completely forgot. To understand where red hair really comes from, you first have to understand what color hair actually is. Every strand growing from your scalp begins inside a tiny structure called a hair follicle. Hidden within it are specialized cells known as melanocytes. Their job sounds simple: manufacture pigment. But they don't produce just one color. Your hair is created from two primary pigments. Eumelanin produces shades ranging from dark brown to black. Pheomelanin creates yellow, orange, and reddish tones. Think of them as two artists working on the same canvas. If eumelanin dominates, hair appears darker. If pheomelanin becomes more prominent, while dark pigment production decreases, lighter shades begin to emerge. In rare circumstances, the balance shifts dramatically enough that the familiar browns and blacks almost disappear. The result is red hair, simple on the surface, far more complicated underneath. For decades, geneticists believed they had already solved this puzzle. The spotlight quickly fell on a single gene called MC1R, located on chromosome 16. Its role is remarkably important. Instead of producing pigment directly, MC1R acts like a molecular switch. When functioning normally, it encourages pigment cells to produce more eumelanin, the darker pigment that offers greater protection from ultraviolet radiation. Certain inherited variants reduce that signal. When the switch becomes less active, pigment production shifts toward pheomelanin. Hair gradually turns auburn, then copper, then bright red. It sounds almost mechanical. Gene changes. Pigment changes. Mystery solved. Except it wasn't. Because people carrying the same MC1, our variant can look completely different. Some have vivid red hair. Others have strawberry blonde hair. Some never develop red hair at all. Meanwhile, researchers identified individuals with naturally red hair who carry different combinations of genetic variants altogether. The closer scientists looked, the more the picture blurred. That was the first crack. Then came another. MC1 is among the most variable genes in the human genome. Most genes remain remarkably stable across populations. This one doesn't. Researchers have identified dozens of naturally occurring variants, many concentrated in Northern and Western Europe, but not all sharing the same evolutionary history. Some mutations appear relatively recent. Others are considerably older. That raises an uncomfortable question. If one mutation created red hair, why are there so many different versions? The answer begins to pull the story away from simple inheritance and towards something much larger. Evolution rarely preserves traits for no reason. Every generation quietly edits the human genome. Most changes disappear. A few survive. Even fewer spread across entire populations. Red hair managed to survive despite remaining exceptionally uncommon. That alone deserves attention, because rarity does not mean weakness. Sometimes rarity means a trait followed a very specific path through history, one shaped by geography, climate isolation, and chance working together over thousands of years. Population geneticists call some of these events founder effects. Imagine a small community becoming separated from everyone else. Only a fraction of humanity's genetic diversity travels with them. Generation after generation, certain traits become more common. Not because they are better, but because the community began with a limited genetic deck. History repeats the process often enough, and entire regions begin developing distinctive genetic signatures. The landscape itself becomes part of the story. That idea explains part of the mystery. Only part. Because founder effect alone cannot explain why multiple red hair variants appear across different populations, or why some became unusually common in places separated by hundreds of miles. There's another layer, one written long before kingdoms, languages, or national borders existed. It begins during one of the harshest periods human beings have ever survived, and it starts with ice. More than 20,000 years ago, Europe looked nothing like it does today. Much of the northern half of the continent lay beneath enormous sheets of ice. In some places, those glaciers were more than a kilometer thick. Vast stretches of land that now support forest cities and farmland were simply uninhabitable. Human populations did not disappear. They retreated. Small groups found refuge in regions where the climate remained just tolerable enough to survive. Archaeologists often refer to these places as Ice Age refugia. Three became especially important: the Iberian Peninsula, parts of the Italian peninsula, and a broad region stretching across southern France into the Balkans. Those isolated communities would become the genetic reservoirs from which much of Europe was later repopulated. That matters because isolation changes evolution. Imagine taking a deck of cards with thousands of unique combinations and allowing only a handful of cards to continue into the next round. Repeat that process for hundreds of generations, and the deck begins to look very different from the one you started with. Human DNA behaves in much the same way. Population geneticists call this genetic drift. Unlike natural selection, drift doesn't favor traits because they are useful. Sometimes traits simply become more common because the surviving population happened to carry them. That may explain part of the red hair story, but only part. Ancient DNA has complicated that picture considerably. During the last 2 decades, researchers have extracted DNA from hundreds of prehistoric skeletons discovered across Europe. Laboratories at institutions including the University of Copenhagen, the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology, and other international research teams have reconstructed genomes from people who lived thousands of years before written history. Those genomes reveal that Europe was never populated by a single people. Instead, it was shaped by repeated waves of migration. First came hunter-gatherers who spread across the continent after the glaciers began retreating around 15,000 years ago. Thousands of years later, farming communities moved westward from Anatolia, bringing agriculture, livestock, and new genetic lineages. Then, around 5,000 years ago, pastoralists associated with the Pontic-Caspian steppe expanded into Europe, introducing still another layer of ancestry. Modern Europeans carry varying proportions of all three. That realization transformed the way scientists think about ancestry. There isn't one European genetic story. There are several, woven together over thousands of years. And somewhere inside those migrations, the genetics of red hair found opportunities to persist. Researchers studying the MC1, our gene, noticed something unusual. Instead of a single mutation responsible for red hair, they identified multiple variants capable of reducing the activity of the same receptor. Some variants are relatively common in northwestern Europe. Others appear only in specific populations. This suggests that similar traits can arise through different genetic paths. Evolution sometimes arrives at the same destination more than once. Let that settle. Nature is remarkably creative. Yet geography still presents another puzzle. If red hair were simply the product of random mutations, you would expect those variants to be scattered evenly around the world. They aren't. The highest frequencies consistently appear in northwestern Europe. Scotland is often estimated to have the highest proportion of natural redheads, with roughly 10 to 13% of the population. Ireland follows closely behind, while much of the rest of Europe shows substantially lower frequencies. Outside Europe, naturally occurring red hair becomes increasingly uncommon, though it can still appear wherever the necessary genetic variants are inherited. That geographic clustering raises another question. Why there? One explanation focuses on sunlight. Northern Europe receives significantly less ultraviolet radiation than regions closer to the equator. Human skin depends on ultraviolet light to produce vitamin D, a nutrient essential for bone development, immune function, and many other biological processes. Darker skin protects against excessive UV exposure in sunny climates. In regions with long winters and weaker sunlight, lighter pigmentation can improve vitamin D production. This idea has broad support among evolutionary biologists. But red hair itself probably wasn't a target selection. Rather, it may have accompanied lighter skin as populations adapted to northern environments. Genes rarely act alone. One mutation can influence several traits at the same time, a phenomenon geneticists call pleiotropy. The same genetic changes associated with red hair often contribute to fair skin and increased sensitivity to sunlight. The package travels together. Even then, the story remains incomplete because there are costs. Fair skin burns more easily. Higher sensitivity to ultraviolet radiation increases the lifetime risk of certain skin cancers. If evolution constantly balances advantages against disadvantages, why would these variants survive at all? That question has occupied researchers for years. Some propose that improved vitamin D production provided enough benefit in low-light environments to outweigh the risks. Others argue that population isolation and genetic drift played equally important roles. And some believe the answer is a combination of several forces acting over thousands of years rather than a single evolutionary event. Science has not settled that debate. In many ways, that uncertainty is what makes the story compelling. The evidence points in the same general direction, but not every detail has fallen into place. The closer researchers examine ancient DNA, the more they realize that human evolution rarely follows a straight line. It twists, it branches, it circles back on itself. And then another discovery forced scientists to ask an even larger question. Some of the genes influencing human appearance today may preserve echoes of encounters with populations that disappeared tens of thousands of years ago. Whether those encounters played any role in the story of red hair remains a subject of active research, but they reveal something much bigger. Our ancestry is far more interconnected than earlier generations ever imagined, and that opens the next chapter of the mystery. The farther scientists pushed into the genetic record, the less convincing the old maps became. For centuries, people tried to explain red hair using kingdoms, tribes, and modern national identities. The trait became associated with Scotland, Ireland, and, to a lesser extent, parts of Wales. That picture isn't entirely wrong. It's simply incomplete. Genes do not recognize borders. They move with people. A coastline can preserve them. A mountain range can isolate them. A migration can scatter them across thousands of miles. Long before anyone spoke English, Gaelic, or Welsh, human populations were already carrying the genetic variants that would eventually produce red hair. That realization changed the conversation. Researchers began comparing entire genomes rather than individual traits. Instead of asking where red hair exists today, they asked how the populations carrying those variants became connected over thousands of years. The answers were remarkably consistent. Modern DNA studies show that people living in northwestern Europe share ancestry from multiple prehistoric populations. Hunter-gatherers, early farmers from Anatolia, and pastoralists from a Eurasian steppe each contributed pieces of today's genetic landscape. No single migration explains everything. No single population does either. That matters because physical appearance can be misleading. Two people may both have bright red hair, while sharing very different combinations of genetic variants. Another person may carry several red hair-associated variants, yet never develop red hair at all. Genetics is rarely controlled by one switch. It is more like an orchestra. Some genes carry the melody. Others quietly influence the final performance. Researchers now know that while MC1 plays a leading role, additional genes, including OCA2, HERC2, and several pigmentation-related regions, help determine the final appearance. Hair color emerges from interactions across the genome, rather than a single mutation acting alone. That makes every redhead genetically unique, not symbolically, literally. Let that settle. The story becomes even more interesting when medicine enters the picture. For decades, anesthesiologists noticed something curious during routine procedures. Some patients with natural red hair appeared to require slightly different amounts of certain anesthetic agents. It sounded anecdotal at first. Then researchers decided to test it. In the early 2000s, studies led by anesthesiologist Dr. Edwin Leem and colleagues found evidence suggesting that many natural redheads required higher concentrations of certain inhaled anesthetics compared with individuals who did not carry the same pigmentation variants. The difference was measurable. It wasn't enormous, but it was enough to attract scientific attention. Subsequent research explored whether MC1 or variants might also influence certain pain pathways. Some studies suggested differences in pain sensitivity under specific conditions, while others found more modest or inconsistent effects. Science has not reached complete agreement, and that's important to acknowledge. The relationship between red hair, pain perception, and anesthesia remains an active area of research rather than a settled conclusion. The evidence is strongest for certain anesthetic responses, much weaker for sweeping claims about pain tolerance. Intellectual honesty matters here. The data are still evolving. The same is true for another popular claim. You may have heard that redheads are going extinct. It appears in headlines every few years. It sounds dramatic. It isn't supported by genetics. Red hair is usually inherited through recessive variants. That means a person can carry the relevant genetic changes without having red hair themselves. Those variants can remain hidden for generations before appearing again in a child who inherits the right combination from both parents. As long as those variants continue circulating through populations, natural red hair can continue appearing. Rare does not mean disappearing. Those are very different ideas. At this point, it's worth stepping back for a moment. Think about everything the single trait has already revealed: a pigment gene, ice age survival, ancient migrations, population isolation, modern medicine. None of those topics seem connected when viewed separately. DNA quietly ties them together. If you've been enjoying these stories about how genetics preserves echoes of humanity's past, consider subscribing. Every discovery adds another piece to a much larger picture, and there are many more stories still waiting to be uncovered. Because the final layer isn't about appearance at all. It's about evidence. Modern sequencing technology is allowing researchers to reconstruct ancient populations with a level of precision that would have sounded impossible only a generation ago. And those discoveries are beginning to answer a question that has lingered since the first red-haired child was born. Not merely how the trait survives, but why evolution never completely let it disappear. By the early 21st century, the conversation around red hair had changed completely. Scientists were no longer studying a single gene in isolation. They were comparing entire genomes, sequencing ancient skeletons, and tracing genetic lineages across thousands of years. Every new dataset added another layer to the story. And something unexpected began to happen. Independent lines of evidence started pointing in the same direction. Not toward a single ancestor, not toward a single kingdom, toward a history shaped by migration, isolation, climate, and chance acting together over immense stretches of time. That convergence is important. In science, one study can be wrong. One data set can be incomplete. But when archaeology, genetics, climatology, and population history all begin telling compatible stories, confidence grows. The picture becomes clearer. One of the largest breakthroughs came from advances in ancient DNA sequencing. For decades, recovering usable DNA from ancient bones was extraordinarily difficult. Time, moisture, and bacteria gradually break genetic material apart. Most ancient remains preserve only tiny fragments. New sequencing methods changed that. Researchers at institutions including the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology, the University of Copenhagen, and laboratories across Europe developed techniques capable of reconstructing genomes from remains thousands of years old. Each successful sequence became another historical witness, not written in ink, written in DNA. Let that settle. Those ancient genomes revealed something remarkable. Europe did not experience one great migration. It experienced many. Groups expanded. Others disappeared. Communities mixed. Some remained isolated for centuries. Every generation reshuffled the genetic landscape. Traits that are common today often survived not because they were destined to dominate, but because history repeatedly placed them in populations that endured. Red hair appears to be one example of that process. Modern analyses suggest that many of the variants associated with red hair became concentrated in northwestern Europe through a combination of founder effects, population bottlenecks, and long-term adaptation to northern environments. No single explanation accounts for every observation. Instead, several mechanisms appear to have worked together. That makes the conclusion stronger, not weaker. Nature rarely relies on one cause. Climate almost certainly played a role. Northern Europe received substantially less ultraviolet radiation than equatorial regions. Vitamin D production depends on sunlight reaching the skin. In darker environments, lighter pigmentation may improve that process. This broader pattern is supported by substantial evidence across human populations. Exactly how much that influenced the spread of specific MC1 or variants remains an area of active investigation. Scientists agree on the general evolutionary pressures. The precise balance between natural selection and genetic drift is still debated. That distinction matters. Good science separates what is strongly supported from what remains uncertain. Then there is another layer, one that reminds us how interconnected the genome really is. The MC1 or gene influences pigmentation, but it does not work alone. Human appearance results from networks of interacting genes. Researchers have identified additional regions, including ASIP, OCA2, HERC2, and several others, that contribute to pigmentation differences across populations. Each gene adjusts part of the final result. Think of them as musicians rather than solo performers. Remove one instrument, and the melody changes. Keep the orchestra together, and the performance becomes something entirely different. That is why siblings can inherit noticeably different hair colors despite sharing the same parents. The underlying genetic combinations are rarely identical. Every inheritance pattern is its own experiment. The medical implications continue to unfold. Studies have explored links between MC1R variants and increased sensitivity to ultraviolet radiation, helping explain why many natural redheads have a higher lifetime risk of certain skin cancers, particularly melanoma, when exposed to excessive sunlight without protection. That finding is well supported. Other proposed associations remain less certain. Researchers continue investigating possible connections involving immune responses, neurological pathways, and pain perception. Some early findings have been replicated. Others have produced mixed results. Science advances by testing ideas repeatedly, not by accepting the first answer. That process is slower. It is also more reliable. Perhaps the most meaningful discovery has nothing to do with appearance. DNA has shown that visible traits tell only a tiny fraction of the human story. For generations, people assumed appearance revealed ancestry with remarkable accuracy. Modern genomics has overturned that assumption. A person with bright red hair may carry ancestry from many different prehistoric populations. Another individual with dark hair may carry some of the very same genetic variants associated with red pigmentation. Genes are inherited independently. History is layered. Identity is more complicated than appearances suggest. That realization has reshaped anthropology itself. The old habit of placing people into neat biological categories has steadily given way to a richer understanding of human diversity. Our genomes record movement, exchange, adaptation, survival. They resist simple labels. And there is one final point that often goes unnoticed. Every person carrying red hair-associated variants today represents an unbroken chain stretching back through thousands of generations. Parents, grandparents, communities, Entire populations that survived droughts, epidemics, migrations, changing climates, and social upheaval. Each generation passed its DNA to the next, against extraordinary odds. The copper-colored strand you notice in a mirror today is only the visible surface. Beneath it lies a record of journeys that began long before recorded history. The final chapter isn't really about hair at all. It's about what the genome remembers when everything else has been forgotten.